So we are thrilled to have Molly Kim with us today. Molly Kim is a family nurse practitioner currently working in GYN oncology clinical trials. Molly has worked in oncology at Mount Sinai for 5 years. She's passionate about educating patients about clinical trials. And so that's what today's topic is. It's clinical trials and why. So she's going to be unpacking clinical trial terms, answering frequently asked questions, sharing her experiences, and explaining why you should ask your provider about clinical trial opportunities. Molly, thank you so much for joining us today. The virtual floor is yours.
My name is Molly Kim, and I'm a family nurse practitioner. I work in GYN oncology clinical trials. And so the objectives of today will be to familiarize you all with clinical trials, answer frequently asked questions, and debunk some misconceptions that commonly come up. What is a clinical trial and why do we do them? Clinical trial research studies are made to answer specific questions. So here we have a quote from SGO answering our questions of why we do clinical trials. When new treatments for cancer are developed, they are tested through clinical trials. Major advancements in the treatment of gynecologic cancers have been made based on the results of these clinical trials. Trials are important because it helps us to know whether the practices should be added to the standard treatment options offered to patients. Participation in gynecologic cancer trials allows patients access to cutting-edge treatments while helping to establish the standard of care for the next generation of women with these diseases. So I do just want to echo the fact that any FDA-approved treatment offered to you was once a clinical trial. And this allows patients an additional option to receive medication not otherwise available to the general public. So first we'll go into some common terminology, which will aid in the remainder of the PowerPoint. So first we'll talk about arm or cohort. This is a group of participants in a clinical trial, typically all with something in common or randomized to a specific treatment. For example, we have a trial with 2 cohorts. One is with patients who've had prior chemotherapy, and one is for patients without. An investigator is a physician or an advanced practice provider involved in the study. The primary investigator is in charge of the study at that given site. Measurable disease. This is a common criteria for trials and often an inclusion criteria. It's the size of the tumor needed to be on the trial. So generally it's 1 centimeter or 10 millimeters. And for lymph nodes, it has to be 1.5 centimeters. This is needed so that the trial can judge and compare based off of the baseline. Next, performance status is a score based on the patient's ability to complete activities of daily living independently. A patient has to have a certain performance status to go on clinical trials. In other words, patients generally have to be well enough to care for themselves in order to be on the trial. Randomization is a process of assigning a treatment to a patient. So this is typically completed by a computer. And if it's a 50-50 randomization, it's just like a flip of a coin. Randomization is generally not decided by any one person involved in the trial. It is computerized. Placebo is it's a substance that does not have medical properties, and it can be a pill or an IV liquid. In some clinical trials, it's used to assess the effectiveness of the investigational drug. Double blind is when neither the patient or the staff knows what the patient is receiving, whether it's treatment or placebo. Eligibility criteria and inclusion-exclusion criteria is something you will hear often. So this specifically is a list provided by the sponsor that is needed to qualify for the trial. Next, enrollment. This is the number of participants in a clinical study that is always stated in the protocol, and you can ask your provider what the enrollment goal is. A lot of patients will find this interesting to know how many patients similar to them are on the trial. HIPAA stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. Most of you are probably familiar with this by now. but it's most notable for protecting patient privacy. Confidentiality is very important in healthcare, but especially so in clinical trials. And primary outcome, this is a question hoping to be asked by the trial. It could be comparing, a combination drug versus a standard of care to see if it improves overall survival. And overall survival is also a common clinical trial term that we use to assess the effectiveness of the treatment. So next, what goes into a clinical trial startup? There's a lot that happens behind the scenes before a clinical trial is offered to patients. This includes creation of a trial from either a drug company, an investigator, or the government. Once the trial reaches Mount Sinai, for example, it goes through several different processes, including PRMC and IRB approval. These steps can take several months to iron everything out before it is offered to a patient, primarily for safety reasons to ensure everything is worded correctly and that the patient is well protected while being involved on the clinical trial. Who is involved in a clinical trial? And do I get to keep my team? So when you enroll in a clinical trial, you'll interact perhaps with new physicians, nurses, clinical research coordinators, research assistants, data managers, and regulatory professionals. I often get asked, do I keep my current team? Yes. So in my department specifically, you get to keep your current doctor, and you will still be seeing the same nurses and nurse practitioners. In addition to your team, though, you will gain a lot of new faces, which I'll explain further here. So as mentioned, clinical trials are generally sponsored by drug companies or the government. Trials can also be investigator initiated, where a physician can plan the trial. There are several individuals in committees working with you and behind the scenes when you choose a clinical trial. This can include physicians or a physician that you've been referred to see, research nurses such as myself, clinical research coordinators, research assistants, data managers who input the information into the sponsors' databases, and regulatory coordinators who tie it all together. Here's a picture of the research coordinators and data manager that I work with. So in addition to these individuals and groups, I do want to emphasize that you always have access to the multidisciplinary team. This includes social workers, nutritionists, spiritual care specialists, and any other needed referrals. So what happens behind the scenes, and let's talk specifically about the screening period. So I could have a whole talk just on study startup and the committees that regulate the study and the safety, but primarily I'd like to talk about the screening period because this is interesting for patients. Once your physician approaches you about a clinical trial, a research nurse or a clinical research coordinator will pre-screen to see if you're a candidate for the trial in the first place. As we mentioned, there's an inclusion-exclusion criteria, and so it's important that the patients meet this. If you meet the criteria and you wish to proceed, an informed consent document is needed. So this is a lengthy document. It's often around 20 pages or so, which outlines the trial, purpose, options, side effects, any cost. It often has other options included in the informed consent, such as, can the trial contact you in the future? Can we use extra samples that are collected for future research? These are completely optional and do not affect a participation on the actual study. The trial itself is also elective, so you can choose to participate or not and withdraw at any time. The informed consent can only be signed in person or with a physician or someone delegated by the physician. I point that out because often I'll email an informed consent and then patients will say, great, I signed it and I'll email it back to you. However, that is not a valid informed consent. So next, the patient would enter a screening period, which can involve additional visits for blood work, scans, possibly biopsies, and things of this nature. There's a list needed prior to the patient starting the trial, and it's often to confirm the patient's eligibility as well as to obtain a baseline prior to the patient starting. In the meantime, pharmacy is preparing and ordering medications needed. The CRCs are entering information into the databases, and then finally, it is time to start treatment. So the time from signing an informed consent to starting treatment is usually The window is typically 28 days. However, it is possible to start in a shorter time frame if less tests are needed. So phases of a clinical trial. If you've ever been approached about a clinical trial, you've heard that there are different phases. So phase 1 is to explore safety. Phase 2 is to explore efficacy of the drug, or in other words, to see if the medication works. And phase 3 is comparison, which is to see if the investigational drug or combination is more effective than the standard of care treatment. So in phase 3, they compare the standard versus the drug or combination that's being researched to see if it's better than what's already named as the standard of care treatment. There also is a phase 4, although not mentioned in this graphic, and it's studies often occurring after the FDA has approved a drug for marketing. So this is also known as post-marketing research, and it includes requirements and commitments that the study shares more information and collects more data on safety, efficacy, and optimal use. Each phase does have an increase generally in the enrollment numbers and accrual for patients. Title breakdown. So a clinical trial often includes the following elements in the title. This would be an example off the top of my head would be like a phase 3 double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial for patients with X stage of blank cancer. And this basically tells the reader a lot that we need to know about the trial, including what the phase is. So by knowing the phase, we know what they're looking for generally as the goals and the purpose. And then we know what drug the patient is getting based off of the title, and if it's randomized, and if it's blinded, if we know what the patient is receiving, or if that's kept blinded. What to expect from a research visit. So clinical trials sometimes involve more appointments than a regular standard of care treatment. And a lot of patients like this because of the frequency and the one-on-one attention involved. It can involve labs. Treatment is approved based off of the labs. So there can be a wait while the labs are processing. A physician or a sub-investigator, which could be an advanced practice provider, nurse practitioner, or physician assistant, would see and clear the patient for treatment based off of the lab results and how the patient is feeling. Once it's approved, then pharmacy makes the medication and mixes either an IV or prepares bottles of pills. An infusion nurse will administer the treatment if it's IV, and if not, pills will be dispensed, and then an observation period is sometimes needed before departure. I do want to state that not all clinical trials involve medications, but for the sake of this presentation, we will be mostly talking about clinical trials that use medicine, but to be clear, there are some without that element. I hear a lot of the same questions from patients, and so I'd like to share with you some common topics and some common misconceptions. So if a doctor has not approached me about a clinical trial, I presume it is not an option for me. At the time of a new treatment discussion, it's always worth asking your provider if there are any clinical trial options. As mentioned, there are specific criteria for patients to go on a trial. And so it's possible that if a physician hasn't mentioned it, it could be because you aren't a candidate, there's nothing available for the type of cancer or the stage or what have you. However, it's always worth bringing up and asking your provider. If I'm being offered a clinical trial, does it mean that I've run out of other options? No, it does not mean that. So clinical trials are offered to patients with a variety of stages of cancer and at different times in their cancer journey. We here offer trials for surgery, after surgery, for progressive cancer. Just because someone is being offered a clinical trial does not mean there are no more treatments in the queue. And it also doesn't mean that this will be the last option for someone. if I'm taking the spot from someone else who needs it? This is a very common question from patients. As we previously discussed, eligibility criteria is what needs to be met for patients to go on a clinical trial. So if you're a candidate for a clinical trial, by definition, everyone going on the trial is in a similar boat. So being concerned about taking someone else's spot, it's generally not a reason to avoid going on the clinical trial. Also, some trials have very high accruals. So you can always ask the clinical trial team for this if you're curious how many patients go on the trial. Some trials are open for years. Is it possible to only get placebo? So generally not the case unless the standard of care is to do nothing. So a lot of later phase trials will compare the standard of care against a trial drug or a combination. So in these cases, the patient is guaranteed to at least get the standard of care. And then the patient has a 50-50 chance of getting an additional study medication. I don't work with any trials that only have a placebo, but in the case where only a placebo is involved, it would be deemed as safe because the standard would be to do nothing. Do I have to pay or will my insurance cover the trial? Choosing a clinical trial can lead to more visits than standard of care. Oh, excuse me, I read the wrong slide. Are there extra visits associated with clinical trials? So choosing a clinical trial can lead to more visits. The frequency of visits can be discussed in the clinical trial informed consent. And this information is totally available to you upfront. So you'll be able to know the frequency of your visits and any additional visits that are needed when you sign consent. Although it can be challenging arranging transportation and your schedule, a lot of patients do like the more frequent visits that I had mentioned, and it does allow for more frequent checkups and just an extra layer of support. Do I have to pay or will my insurance cover the trial? Also, do I get paid to be on the clinical trial? These are common questions. So some trials, everything is covered. Some trials, everything goes through the insurance if they're already approved treatments. It just varies trial to trial. Generally speaking, some elements will go through the insurance. And then sometimes if insurance is not willing to pay, then the trial is able to assist with that. Do I get paid to be on a clinical trial? Some clinical trials do offer compensation, specifically thinking about patients' commute coming in, things of that nature. This would be outlined in the informed consent. So the answer is yes and no. Sometimes insurance is involved, sometimes not as necessary, and then sometimes there is compensation for clinical trials, but not always. I know someone who is on a trial, but why do I not qualify? So it's common to have conversations with other patients, perhaps in the infusion area while getting treatment, and maybe they mention that they're on a clinical trial, or you hear about a family friend who is on a clinical trial and you think, well, why can't I be on that trial as well? As we previously mentioned, there is a strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, and patients have to meet every single parameter in order to go on the clinical trial. And if any of the exclusion criteria is met, then the patient is also not a candidate. So blood work has to be within a certain range. Patients perhaps have to be within a certain age group or cancer stage. Maybe they could have only had 2 treatments instead of 4 treatments. There are several factors. And so just like no 2 patients are the same, there are a lot of factors that go into what puts a patient on a trial. Where are clinical trials offered? So soon I'll explain clinicaltrials.gov. It's a very helpful website that you can go to, and you can search either by clinical trial title, you can search just by disease type in order to see what clinical trials are offered, and it will also show locations. being that I think majority of us maybe live in New York City or in the New York area. We have access to so many research hospitals. And so it's very fortunate to be able to have access to different clinical trial options that maybe aren't accessible in more rural locations. So who chooses my treatment randomization? Generally, this is decided by a computer. If it's 50-50, then it is just the flip of a coin. When a patient is registered to go on a clinical trial, they're often randomized, and they're either put in one of these cohorts or they're randomized to a certain drug regimen. And in the case of blinding, we don't know if the patient is receiving placebo or if they're receiving the treatment, as previously mentioned. So it's interesting. However, your doctor is not who is deciding which treatment you're receiving in the case of randomization. And where can I get more information? Here is, as mentioned, clinicaltrials.gov. This is the SGO website, so sgo.org/clinical-trials. And this is a very helpful website. It has even more clinical trial terminology and definitions than I had mentioned. And then most hospitals, academic institutions will have a website dedicated to clinical trials where you can go and you can see what is offered for certain disease types. And here's my references from the SGO website itself. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.